Is Christian nationalism simply someone who is a Christian and who loves their country? Doug Wilson has talked about Christian nationalism a lot lately. He's become the poster child of Christian nationalism. And also, John MacArthur's memorial, a couple surprise speakers on this slice of fresh bread. Welcome to Fresh Bread, a podcast ministry of Grace Bible Church, Gainesville, with Pastor Brandon and Pastor Keith. Well, welcome to Fresh Bread. Fresh Bread, where we're bringing the truth of God's Word to a starving world. Fresh Bread Podcast 116. And today, Pastor Brandon and myself, I'm Pastor Keith, we're going to follow up on our two-part podcast with Chris LeDuc by talking about Christian nationalism. By adding to the mix, we're going to throw in Doug Wilson a little bit here today. And then we wanted to talk also about John MacArthur's memorial, if we have time at the end here. And the reason we're bringing all this in is a lot of things have happened. Doug Wilson was on CNN. He did an interview about Christian domination, and so we want to tie into that our Christian nationalism conversation. And again, as a bonus, and we'll have time, we want to talk about John MacArthur's memorial. There were a couple surprise speakers at that, and so we want to talk about that. And also we can even mention about how one of his sons were kind of edited out, but now back in, so we can touch on that as well. So we have an action-packed podcast, so let's dive in. I'm Pastor Keith, he's Pastor Brandon. So Pastor Brandon, let's start with our conversation on Christian nationalism. Are there any final thoughts that you have about our last two podcasts that we did?
Well, I think it's important for Christians to study the subject and not be unaware of it. It's a very important subject because it affects how we live and how we interact with the world, and most especially how we interact with the government. And I think that as Christians, that there needs to be an understanding of the different spheres, the church, the family, and the government, and what the role of each of those is. And, the role of the church is to, baptize and give the sacraments, to share the gospel. The role of the family is to, come together, husband and wife, leave and cleave, and form a unit together to raise children, to fill the earth. And all that's involved with that, and the authority that's there, that's given to the father first, but then also to the mother, and the government to bear the sword. And I think that if we can kind of get that in our minds and understand that, then we can start talking about what us as Christians have, what responsibility we have within those three spheres. Obviously, as in our family, we have a responsibility to our spouse. We have a responsibility to our children to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. In the church, we have a responsibility for upholding the truth, understanding the truth, studying the Bible, praying. We have a responsibility for fellowship. We have a responsibility, to see God's name proclaimed in the church, and then ultimately to the nations. And in terms of the government, paying taxes, and at a minimum paying taxes, and voting, at a minimum. And so, what I think that's kind of my takeaway from our conversation with Chris LeDuc was, that we as Christians ought not be pulling away from government. That the government needs a Christian influence, and needs people who are going to vote and legislate and judge and rule, according to Christian principles.
Okay, I have two questions for you. Can we define Christian nationalism simply as someone who is a Christian and someone who loves his or her country? That's my first question.
I don't think it's that simple.
Okay.
And I think that's probably the idea, or the name Christian nationalism, I think at this point is probably the most unfortunate part of this in my mind. And I don't know if Chris LeDuc, I don't think he would completely agree with me, because he's embraced the term. I don't think it's helpful. I don't think it's helpful because it's been defined by others. And so what we're doing is going back and redefining and defining it, or, as Christians, but in reality, they've already defined it. And as to, and the problem is that there's a racial, and we talked about it in the podcast, and I wish Chris would have addressed this more, but, how do you deal with that negative connotation of white Christian nationalism and the connotation of, that it's a right-wing, almost a fascist way to look at things. And so I think that I don't have a better term, and maybe I shouldn't be so critical if I don't have a better idea, but I think it is unfortunate that has been the tag that's given, and that the definition of that has been dominated by the corporate media. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. I didn't know if you had a better definition of what Christian nationalism is.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I don't know. I mean, Christian nationalism, it like I say, is I think an unfortunate tag. But I think if I were going to define it correctly, it would be that we, as the church, are teaching, making disciples, and teaching them all aspects of life, like teaching them how to walk in wisdom throughout their life, and at every level, in every sphere. I need to teach as a Christian pastor. I need to teach them how to rule in their home. I need to teach them God's word and truth, and how to interact with government. And I need to encourage those who, are called in those ways to, do that according to the Lord. Like, not, some politicians, many politicians today who call themselves Christians, they still do worldly stuff, and they rule in a worldly way. Part of that's because, and this is one of our people said this, and, part of that's because there's this influence in government that's a completely secular influence. And so as Christians, if you're part of that, then you have to kind of parse your way through that. And, we have to, deal with that and understand, because, they're gonna have a different definition of separation of church, between church and state than we are. Their definition is going to be that you can't do anything that's overtly Christian, or I say the folks that would be anti-Christian, are going to say, well, you can't do anything that's Christian in the government. You can't be influenced by Christian teaching, that you need to be secular and how you rule, and how you legislate, and how you judge. And yet I think that we need to encourage our people that they can be, they can live out their faith. They can live out their faith not only in their families, their private lives. They can live out their faith not only in the church, but they can also live out their faith in the workplace, and live out their faith in as they interact with Christian government, or with government.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, for people who say that Christians should not be involved in government at all, wasn't that authorized by God? We talk about the law and government and family. Those are all.
Yeah, I mean, the government bearing the sword goes all the way back to, Genesis 9, the Noahic covenant. And, that sort of that idea of eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. And I've made the what I believe is that God in Genesis chapter 9 instituted human government. And from that point forward, like the Code of Hammurabi, I personally think is the principle of an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, came from the Noahic covenant. And we see that's the Code of Hammurabi is the first code that was written down. But that doesn't mean the Code of Hammurabi somehow trumps, what Israel did, or even influence what Israel did. That the reason why there's a connection is because both are connected to Genesis chapter 9.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. So, I mean, for Christians to pull away from government, I think that is not the right way to look at it. But I think you can't become so obsessed with it that it takes away from the gospel. Everything else that happens is, but I think we need to be involved with what's happening around us, right?
Sure. We don't need to be dominated by it, like you say, like you just said. But at the same time, as Christians, I mean, I can make the case that part of the reason why we're in the fix that we're in when it comes to the government and how secular it is and, the wokeness and all of that is because Christians have disengaged. Like and I think that's Chris LeDuc's point, is that as Christians, we've disengaged from this because it's the general attitude, the general Christian attitude is that we're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And, is that really what we're doing? And I think he makes a good argument that it's not just rearranging the chairs on the Titanic, even though we know that ultimately it's going to sink.
Absolutely. So could we define it simply? I mean, I know you don't like the phrase Christian national, but could it be defined as should America be ruled by Christ? Could that be that simple?
Well, considering that Christ is the ruler of all, no matter whether you accept it or not, then yes, I think America would be a better place if we look to Christ as our ultimate authority.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's, I'm going to bring in right now Doug Wilson, because when we talk about Christian nationalism, I know that word is, but that's what we're going to use because that's what everyone's calling it. Doug Wilson he's like the main guy right now. When you think of that, when you look up the word Christian nationalism dictionary, you usually see his picture in it. And I just want to introduce him. I don't know if everybody knows who he is, who are listening to this podcast, but Doug Wilson, he's a 72-year-old theologian and pastor. He's pastor of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, and his church has doubled in size in the last 4 years. He's also a member of the faculty at the New St. Andrew College, and he's known for his writings on classical Christian education and Reformed theology. He doesn't believe in a literal 1,000-year reign, so he's a post-mill guy, but he really fights for this Christian nationalism and covenant theology. He's kind of known for that. And again, I think you and I would agree with a lot of what he says, but we also have some reservations on some of the things that he says. And so I just he did a CNN interview just recently, and so a lot of things that he said in there, I was like, yeah, that sounds great, but how would you even implement it? And is it too late for that to be implemented? And those are the things that I was thinking as I was listening to it. So I just want to ask you a couple questions here as we think about Doug Wilson. Is he, like I've heard people say, he's almost becoming like a cult figure. His church, like I said, is doubled, and post-mill people are just flocking to him. So I just want to ask you this question. We know that the Christian faith, it advances by the Holy Spirit. It doesn't advance by the sword. And I just want to ask you, where in the Bible does it say that the world will become Christianized without Christ ruling? Does it even talk about that? And where is he getting his, that the world should be Christian before Christ comes back?
Well, I mean, we've done a podcast on postmillennialism and, trying to understand, what is driving them in that way. And as far as Doug Wilson, when it comes to Christian nationalism, you can't separate his postmillennialism from it. Now, having said that, and Chris LeDuc argued that even as pre-mill guys, we, because there's, God's decree, his revealed will and his decreed will. And so, there's a, what we know is going to happen. We know that that things are going to proceed from bad to worse. But he's also decreed that we would, that we live in this world. And even though we're not of this world, we still interact with the world. And it's interesting because the Thessalonians in 2 Thessalonians were, withdrawing from the world. They were because they believed Christ's return was imminent, like at any time while they were still living. Many of them stopped working, and they were creating problems. They were being busybodies. And so, yeah, I mean, God doesn't want us to withdraw from the world, that we need to be interacting with the world, that ultimately we are an outpost for the kingdom as the church, and we need to be going out and we need to be preaching the gospel, and we need to be salt and light. I mean, that's Matthew 5, where Christ says that we are to be salt and light. Well, I can't be salt and light if I withdraw from the world, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, but we can't, when you go back to Doug Wilson, you can't separate the fact what he's saying is that we're here to make the world better. We're here to Christianize the world. That's that's sort of our goal. And I think he would probably say, I think Matthew 28, I think we talked about that before, go and make disciples of the nations. We take that to be that we're to preach the gospel and we're to baptize. Like that the mode of making disciples of the nation is to preach the gospel among the nations. And I think he would probably take it more as that we're making the nations disciples. Like as a whole, we would say it's, the individuals within the nation that we are preaching the gospel to, and that ultimately they'll be from every tribe, tongue, and nation who worship the Lord. That's how I've seen it and how I still see it. But it would seem that, Doug Wilson's more on the this idea of actually making Christian nations. And, I think that nations need to come under the lordship of Christ, right? I need to tell people who are ruling that whether you accept it or not, you are under the rulership. You are under he is the king, and he's the king of the nation. And that as the nation obeys him and lives according to his law, that nation is going to be blessed. And as a Christian, I shouldn't back off of that. And so, the post-millennial flavor that's there, this idea that we're making the world better for Christ to return. I just don't see that in Scripture, and I personally don't see it, and I know there's probably other places that they would use, but the Matthew 28 one is what jumps off the page to me.
Let's just start with this. What are there any differences between what Chris LeDuc and his pre-mill and Doug Wilson's post-mill? Are there any differences in that kind of Christian nationalism, or is it the same thing? Or I think you kind of just explained some of it.
Yeah, I mean, with Chris LeDuc, it's more that God's, there's God's decreed will for living the Christian life, and his decreed will for the world, and that we know that it's going to proceed from bad to worse. But then there's the will of, like, how do we live in the world, and so do we get involved in government, and do we get involved in what is or do we withdraw? And I think what he's saying is that withdrawing is not the answer. Like I can't say, well, the ship is going down, so therefore I don't need to be involved at all. That God has called us to preach the gospel. God has called us to model righteousness, and we do that in every sphere that we're involved in. And we shouldn't be withdrawing from any of the spheres. We shouldn't withdraw obviously can't withdraw from the church, but we shouldn't, that would be, becoming apostate. But, we shouldn't be withdrawing from the family either. Like I'm responsible as a father, I'm responsible as a husband, and I need to uphold that responsibility. But at the same time, I live in a nation, and I need to be a guy that is engaged and understands politics and understands government. I can't withdraw that way. And I think that's where Chris LeDuc is at, which is there's definitely overlap between where Chris is at and where Doug Wilson is at. But I think the difference that we have to recognize is the whole post-millennial piece.
Yeah, because I was going to say, what are we not doing that Doug Wilson would say we have to do in order to Christianize the world? The Holy Spirit is winning one soul at a time. So is there anything we can do different? Like I can't remember what he says that we need to do or just Christianize America and then go Christianize the world. Is that what he's saying? I'm not sure.
No, that's not where Chris is at.
No, I'm talking about Doug Wilson.
Oh, Doug Wilson. Yeah. Doug Wilson is there. That's the difference. I think that Chris would say we need to preach the gospel. We need to make disciples, and then we need to send them out into the various spheres. Whether it's the sphere of family, whether it's the sphere of church, or whether it's the sphere of government, but that we shouldn't shrink back from people being in government, and we should even celebrate when someone wants to be a part of government. And I know that's controversial. Like I say, I had a discussion with a person on this past Saturday that doesn't see it that way, that they think that we should withdraw from the world, because, especially from government, because the government is corrupt. But I would argue the reason the government's corrupt is because there's not enough salt and light there.
Yeah.
And you can't hasten along, like the Thessalonians were withdrawing from the world to sort of hasten along what the Lord's promise to return. We shouldn't withdraw from government, being involved from government, because we believe that he's going to return any time. No, we need to be being faithful and continuing to be salt and light in all of the spheres in order, as Christ's to return is imminent. I mean, and Christ, he said, will there be anyone found faithful? I think faithfulness is part of that. And that I think that maybe the decline that we know is going to happen is because there is some people who are withdrawing from those areas and allowing a secular worldview to dominate.
I mean, like you said, I agree with a lot of what Doug Wilson says. Like, he said that if we were a Christian nation, we wouldn't, and this is his words, he said we wouldn't be having a clown show where transgender people or drag queen story time, they would be doing story time for kids or all these things. And I just don't know how, let's say all of a sudden we Christianize America, would we have to do like President Trump's doing, when bringing the National Guard, force these laws on people? Or like, I don't understand how you can do it from outside in when it should be inside out. You know what I mean?
Sure. I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I mean, I think that, I think that the problem is just because it's hard doesn't mean it's not right. Right. Yeah. I have a good answer for how it would all work? No. I mean, because it's hard. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to think through, and how you respond is, and it's just very difficult. And that's why it's such a big topic at this point, is because there are people that are on all sides of this. And yet, I can't avoid what's right because it's hard. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah,
that's
just because I don't see how, as an example, like you say, I don't see how you're going to get the toothpaste back in the tube, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying. Like we should be engaged in doing that. And we're not talking about like the church getting involved with government. We're talking about the Christian, the disciple of Christ that is now involved in the sphere of government and legislating and ruling and judging based on Christian principles and holding people to an understanding that Christ is king. And so, yeah, I mean, is it going to be hard? I mean, are there going to be, if we're able to have this kind of influence, are there going to be issues? Absolutely. I mean, because, yeah, getting the toothpaste back in the tube is going to be very difficult.
I'm just trying to understand how, because we would agree with, again, a lot of what he's saying, but what are we not doing that we should be doing? Because we're, as pastors, I'm just talking about you and I, we're teaching the word, we're equipping the saints, and they're going out and they're, teaching their family and their sphere of influence. So that's what I'm trying to understand is what do we need to do? I guess we're not Doug Wilson. We can't get inside his head, but what would he say that we're not doing or that we need to do? And you might not know either.
Well, I mean, I think he would say, even though we're not where he's at, in terms of how we would engage, because of his postmillennial bent. But I think that he would say that we shouldn't be encouraging our people to withdraw from the world. Like, just sort of say, well, it's all going to be dominated by a secular worldview, therefore, and we can't get the toothpaste back in the tube, therefore we shouldn't be engaged. And there are a lot of pastors who've said that that we're here to share the gospel, and we have, that this is the world, we're living in the world, but we're not to be of the world. And that's a worldly sphere. And, we shouldn't have anything to do with that. I think that's, again, I think Chris is challenging us to think through that. Is that proper? I mean, is that the way that we should respond to the world and respond to the government and how we engage with the government? And so, yeah, I mean, even though it's going to be difficult and it's going to be hard as Christians, as you know, for us, we need to be encouraging our people really to be, if you want, just going back again, I've said it a couple of times, but we need to be encouraging our people like Christ encouraged them, is, you know, to be salt and light in every aspect of their life, whatever they're doing. And, you know, if it's voting, they need to vote according to Christ. If it's, you know, being a husband, he needs to be a husband, you know, in Christ, and wife in Christ. And so, you know, I mean, as Christian pastors, we need to be encouraging our people that if that God has them, you know, involved in government, you know, in whatever aspect, they need to be ruling according to Christian principles. You know, it's interesting because we have one of our people who is, you know, I think head over their neighborhood HOA. You know, I encourage him, you know, to make decisions that are in concert with, you know, biblical principles, that he ought to avoid being influenced by worldly principles, and he ought to be ruling in that situation, you know, with the authority that he's been given. He ought to be ruling with Christian principles, and I think he is. But you know, from what I can tell, but you know, to say, well, you shouldn't be involved in that because it's corrupt and it's secular, I don't think that would be the right way to go about it as, you know, Christian pastors.
There are right ways to kind of, I don't want to say retreat from society, but there are correct ways of pulling back. We look at public schools, right? You don't want to send young Christian kids into a public school the way they are right now. So we have homeschool and things like that, right?
Well, the problem is that school is the sphere of the family. Like, it's the family's responsibility to educate their children. And I mean, that's biblical. You bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And so Christian parents have been given that mandate by God to raise their children. And so and to instruct their children. And so when they sub that out to the government, which is what they're doing when they send them to public school, they're subbing out that responsibility to government. And, you know, and so and especially if they and I'm not saying you could never go to public school. A couple of my kids, actually all three of my kids, actually all four of my kids actually spent some time in public school, and it was just the deal, but where we were at. But we never withdrew from that. Like, we never withdrew from our responsibility. It's our responsibility to educate our children. I mean, there was they came to a point where they needed, you know, more than we could give them in that situation. And I know every family's in a different position. And I'm not even saying that we did, you know, what was right. I wished I would have gone differently, especially with one or two of my kids. But at the same time, I, as a Christian father, I can't just say, well, I just fed my kids to the wolves and I have no responsibility over that, because you do. And yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but
no, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Is that I think there are times where, like we were talking about being salt and light. Okay, send our kids into the public school so they are salt and light, but they're so they're outnumbered by what's going on with these. I don't want to call them strange teachers, but just the way that they embrace so many things that we would not allow in our own home. To send our kids into that would be wrong. So yeah, we hold them back. We teach them at home. And then even secular colleges, you send your kids out when they're 18, 19. Hopefully they have that foundation and they're not going to be swayed. But then they can be salt and light in their college dorms, whatever it is, with all these secular kids who are coming to college who maybe have never heard the gospel. These are the things I'm thinking that we are doing as Christians to spread the gospel. Hopefully, again, our sphere of influence. Each person has a sphere, work, family, everything else, that they can be being salt and light. That's what I'm trying to say. Is that, and for Doug Wilson, I understand what he's saying. I just don't know. And I think I asked Chris this, and I said, how do we do it? Is it too late? And he said, well, it's never too late. I understand God can do anything, but and I'm not saying we are defeatist as as pre-mill, but we do believe that Christ is the one who will come back and set up his kingdom, and he will reign, and the world will be Christianized. That's how we see it. But the post-mill sees that the church is the one that's going to Christianize the world. And I know the Holy Spirit can do anything. God can do anything, but we just don't see it that way. And so it's hard for me at least, to wrap my head around how that's going to work. And I don't know if you have that same problem, but that's just maybe me. I don't know. What do you think?
Like I said, I don't think it would be easy, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't at least be engaged. I mean, that's where I'm at, that, just because it's hard to parent my kids doesn't mean I shouldn't be engaged in doing so. Just because it seems impossible to bring government back under the subjection of Christ doesn't mean that we shouldn't be at least calling them to it. And I think that's where, again, where Chris is at, is that we need to be making disciples, and wherever they are influencing, whether it's, their own family or government, or in the church, we ought to be encouraging them to be salt and light in those areas. And so that means enacting Christian, if you're in government, enacting Christian laws, ruling as a Christian, that you believe God's word, and you believe that he knows best, and he's the one that has the wisdom of how life should be, and ruling according to that. And so, obviously, if you're a legislator, you're legislating against abortion, legislating against, women being in combat, things that we would say are definitely more in line with Scripture.
Yeah, and Doug Wilson, there's another word called Christian Reconstructionism. I think he would fall on that side, and it would be wonderful, because what that means is that society would be reconstructed under the lordship of Christ in every aspect of life, which would be wonderful to live in that. we kind of see that coming.
Well, that will definitely happen when Christ returns.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, but. Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not where, the Christian reconstruction, I'm not there, but I do think that we should be calling the government under the lordship of Christ.
We just keep going, and we just see what happens. We just be faithful and see what the Lord does. So, last word on Christian nationalism: we're in favor of it or against it?
Well, I'm nuanced in it, obviously, and I don't like my understanding of it and understanding biblically. I definitely see things that I definitely agree with Doug Wilson on quite a bit of stuff. I agree, obviously, with Chris LeDuc on probably more stuff, in terms of that. I do think that as pastors that we need to be more focused on, the gospel, and, that we as Christians shouldn't be, as is the church, like it's not our responsibility to get to be in government. But at the same time, we should speak out and speak the things that, speak out and basically tell people that they are under the lordship of Christ, that the government is under the lordship of Christ. And, that we ought to be people who are willing to speak the truth that way.
Again, if the definition, I know this is too simple, but if Christian nationalism is a definition simply of a Christian who loves his country, then that would be me, but I don't love my country more than I love Christ. And so I would love him more. But if that's what it is, then I would be a Christian nationalist, I guess. But that's kind of our Christian nationalism talk. And if anybody is listening, has more questions, just throw them our way, and we'll be glad to do another podcast on them. Hopefully we clarified it a little bit. Maybe we didn't. I don't know. I think it's just such a interesting topic when you hear men like Doug Wilson. Like we said, we agree with a lot of what he says, but also I just am not sure how. Yeah, I just don't know. Because I know he would flip it and say, well, right now we're living in a secular world and they're forcing things on us. So if we flipped it and then we're forcing things on them, what's the difference, right? It's the same kind of thing. So I don't know. But anyway, that's our Christian nationalism talk. And like I said, if there's anything you guys want to know, just shoot us an email.
We'll maybe come back to Doug Wilson next time, and maybe I can have the time to break down that interview. and
Yeah.
the fuller version of it and address that directly.
Yeah, let's do that. We'll do another podcast. We'll kind of dissect what he said on CNN with a little more in-depth commentary on that. So we can do that. But I want to, let's switch over to second topic that we are going to talk about. And that was the John MacArthur Memorial was last Saturday. And I'm just going to ask you right now, what'd you think of it? What'd you think of the memorial for John MacArthur?
Well, of course, it was a beautiful memorial overall. Obviously the full choir and the full orchestra, and Phil Webb, and you had Jubilant Sykes, and those guys that have been singing there for decades even. That was wonderful. Obviously, the congregational music was wonderful. I thought it was well done, tasteful. The flowers that they had, I thought it was. I just think it was well done overall.
Yeah, I love the Gettys.
The Gettys, another highlight.
It was very wonderful. And again, the only thing that sort of shocked me were the two speakers that they had there. And I don't know if you wanted to touch on that, the two men that were invited by the family to speak at the memorial.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think you're talking about John Piper and Alistair Begg.
Yep.
And we've had some conversations about both on this podcast, and the specific issues with both of them. I know we talked about John Piper on maybe 2 or 3 occasions. And I think we talked about Alistair Begg as well.
Yes, we did.
So, the potential issue with John Piper is probably the biggest thing that is hard to justify is how he's at times linked arms with people that we would say are false teachers. And, that he's been seen on stage with people that we would say, are outside the fold. And I think that's been, even him going back to Shepherd's Conference, and probably 2 or 3 years ago, he was at Shepherd's Conference, and we had that conversation about him at that time. And so there are some things about John Piper that are potentially problematic for sure. And I know you're from Minnesota, and that's where he's at, and have been more affected by him negatively than I have, but. There's definitely things about John Piper that I'm not on board with, that are concerning to me. Alistair Begg, the problem, what happened with Alistair Begg is he was asked not to come back to Shepherd's Conference because he was scheduled to be at Shepherd's Conference, but he came out and said that he, gave this advice to a grandmother to, attend a gay wedding, or was it trans? This stuff gets so muddled to me that sometimes I don't know which one's which.
It was homosexual wedding.
Okay, so it was a homosexual wedding. And, and I honestly think that was wrong advice. Like it was wrong advice. And I think that, the Shepherd's Conference people were right at the time to ask him not to attend and not to speak. On the other hand, now he is at MacArthur, of all the people that could have been there, he's at MacArthur's funeral. So that's and you can say the same thing about John Piper, is that, of all the people who could have spoke, why John Piper, why Alistair Begg?
Yeah, I mean, and to me, and this is just my 2 cents, I think it distracted a little bit from the memorial. I agree with you. I think it was a wonderful memorial, but I think by having those two there, kind of that's been the talk rather than how wonderful it was. It was very Christ-centered, which we knew would be from John MacArthur. But here's, again, this is my 2 cents, because I was going to ask you this question. If Alistair Begg was unfit to preach, and maybe unfit's a bad word, but unfit to preach at the Shepherd's Conference, why was he okay to do it at John MacArthur's memorial? But I think it would be that it was more of a distraction at Shepherd's Conference. I think that's why they asked him not to come, right?
Well, yeah, but you have to remember that maybe you don't know this, and maybe our listeners don't, but it wasn't the elders and it wasn't the church that put together this funeral program. It was actually the family.
Right.
And, evidently the family knew that that John MacArthur valued those relationships, even though there were issues. Like, even though he didn't completely agree with them in every way, he still valued those relationships. And at the end of the day, it's a funeral. I mean, it's not, we're not talking about the Shepherds Conference. The Shepherds Conference, I think, has probably a higher level of accountability as to who you allow to teach at a Shepherds Conference, and how, doctrinally aligned they need to be. And yet at a funeral, it's a little bit, there's I think a different standard that's there. And it's, it's a public, and unfortunately, with a public guy like John MacArthur, it's going to be very public. I mean, and it was, there were probably 5,000 or 6,000 people on campus there. There was, and not only that, but there was, it was streamed all over the place. And so, there were, probably hundreds of thousands of people who have seen that, the funeral. And so it was a very public thing, but we can't lose sight of, this was the family's memorial, and they made the decisions, and we can't lay that at that we can't lay that at Grace Community Church's feet or Grace to You's feet, or because they didn't make those decisions. And so I respect, for me personally, I respect that the family has the responsibility to do what they feel like would be honoring to the Lord, but also to John MacArthur. So
for some reason, when I was watching it, I was thinking that so many people have passed away. Some of the men who are blazing the trail, like we talk about radio ministries, we had Grace to You, and when you look at John Piper and Alistair Begg, they're also on the radio. So I was thinking maybe these are the last of the guys who influenced so many people. And Chuck Swindoll could have been there as well, but I don't know how close of friends they were. But they would be like the last of the men who have this radio ministry that's still going on, to pay their respects to John MacArthur, who was John MacArthur. Like, I think it was John Piper that said that has influenced, and even I think Begg said it too, influenced so many pastors. Like, he just really has influenced a lot of men.
Yes.
But I was kind of disappointed in a way. I would have loved to have heard Phil Johnson. I would have loved to have heard Tom Pennington. Some of these men get up and also share, because they worked with him and things like that. But they did bring in Alistair Begg and John Piper. And I'm not a big John Piper guy. Just even his style, his voice, everything, kind of like, ugh. But some people love him, and that's fine. But I was going to ask you, because I've heard some people say, was this a message by Grace Church? Was Grace Church trying to say, hey, let's unite, let's bygones be bygones, and let's reset? Do you think that's what they were saying, or do you think it was just the family inviting these guys?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know that I can speak to that. Todd Friel did a video, I think you watched it as well, where he said that he felt like this was more of a move toward unifying, and that there's been so much fracturing that's happened over the past 5 years, especially since 2020, and that maybe this is a move toward healing some of that. And and I think there does need to be healing, but I don't think we can back off the truth to do it. And that's where is this a sign that that they're moving in a different direction? I don't think so. I just think that I'm more along the lines of, it was the family's decision that these are two men that had a lot of influence in John MacArthur's life, and he saw them as friends, and that he would want them to actually speak at his funeral. And so I don't necessarily have to agree with it. Like, I don't have to be one who says, I want to choose to believe that it was done because, of those friendships. And I think those friendships continued behind the scenes. And maybe there is a lesson for us in that, and that, when we differ on non-essentials, that we don't withdraw ourselves to a point that's unhealthy.
I don't think it tainted MacArthur's legacy. Do you?
Oh, no, I don't think so.
To have these two.
There's going to be some people who are detractors and who are going to say that that it did and it shouldn't have done that, but I don't think overall it does. But that's just my opinion anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this is different. It's not a theological conference, and these two men, even though they are right on the tightrope of Like you and I talked before the show, I don't think Alistair Begg would come out and say, yeah, I'm in favor of homosexual marriage. What he's trying to say is he's trying to build bridges between, homosexuals and the church and just trying, I don't know, I can't speak for him, but I think what he's saying is that we need to show love to them so that they would understand that they are living a sinful life, but do it in a loving way, which as a pastor it can be kind of a slippery slope, because then it can be misinterpreted as what I think has been misinterpreted by a lot of people, that he is in favor of it. I don't think he would ever go as far as false teacher Andy Stanley would. I don't think he would ever come out and say that, right? I mean, we've talked about that. That's kind of what our consensus is, right?
I don't know what's in Alistair Begg's heart. I mean, I know that it was a misstep, and that's, again, that's my opinion, that he shouldn't have given that advice, and that he should have, even if he gave it, and it was wrong advice, and he should have backed off of it. Like, he should have, once he was challenged, he should have said, look, you're right. That was wrong advice, and I was dumb for saying it. I mean, that's what you would hope that he would do, but I'm not ready to judge him and say, well, yeah, he's definitely headed down a bad road, and this is ultimately going to be where he's going to be attending pride parades, and, that he's going to be embracing homosexuals in the church and, wrapping arms around them. I'm not there yet. Now, if he makes other decisions that show me that that's where he's at, then, at that point we can, that we can deal with that. But at the moment, I just see it as something that he made, that it was an error in judgment. Unfortunately, from what I can tell, he hasn't backed off of it. I think, there was even a more recent thing that interview that you brought up, that, he kind of doubled down on it. And, that's unfortunate for sure. And I think John MacArthur would say that's wrong, that he was wrong. I know he would, because he did. But yeah, I'm just not to the point of saying, well, for sure he's headed down a slippery slope, and the next thing we know, where he's going to be embracing homosexuals and marching in gay parades. I'm not there. And I think that the family must not be there either, because that, they did invite him to pray at the funeral.
Yeah, and I think that's what disappoints me, is the fact that he has tripled down and calling people Pharisees that have criticized him for that. I think he needed to say, look, I need to clarify this. I'm not in favor of it, but this is what I'm saying. But he's sort of going in the direction of defending himself, and that's where I'm worried about it. And I know he's stepping down as senior pastor, so this may all be for nothing, because he may fade away. But it doesn't take away the fact that he was uninvited to the Shepherds Conference, I think, beginning because it was a distraction. So they decided, look, don't come.
Which I think was the right decision at the time.
Right. I mean, and then to see him just pop up at the memorial was a little bit shocking, but again, it's not a conference.
Yeah, it's not a theological conference, and that there's an underlying friendship that must have continued. And so, and I think it's something to really think through. I mean, the whole homosexual issue is a big issue for the church. And how do we engage? And, or do we engage? And, we've talked about it before, and, how do you handle it when a homosexual walks through the doors, and how do you respond to them? And I think that if his heart is, I don't want to just like disengage myself and not talk to them, but I need to, as a person made in the image of God, I need to, where I can, I need to be a part of their life if the Lord brings them into my life. But at the same time, that I need to be doing that with the idea of, or with the purpose of telling them and being very clear what God says about homosexuality. Even though I'm, they're in my life and I can have a relationship with them, And this has actually happened to me. I mean, I've actually have had someone who was a homosexual who is now thankfully has repented of that and has turned from it, and was married to someone that was her own sex, and is now walking with the Lord. How do you deal with that? Like when they first initially come and they're still in that type of relationship. And I think if that's where Alistair Begg was at and trying to work through that and understand it and trying to deal with it, I can definitely sympathize with him, but I think ultimately his advice was wrong, right? I don't think that we should celebrate, that I wouldn't want to be a part of any part of a gay wedding, because that would be celebrating homosexuality. And I think that that's something that God does not celebrate. But at the same time, if you're talking about just completely not having a relationship with them at all, then I think that's problematic at all. I mean, that's problematic as well. And so what's the answer? Well, it's prickly. I mean, it's not an easy answer. And how you deal with that and how you kind of walk through that. I mean, sin is dirty. I mean, and you're going to get some mud on you sometimes. And as you rub elbows with sinners. And how do you do that in a situation where they're in known sin that way? My answer is that we need to be as gracious as we can be, but at the same time, they need to know and understand the truth. I mean, and I think we need to be people who have a relationship to a level that at least they respect that you have your position, right? That you haven't just ostracized them to a point of, I can't even have a conversation with you, and I definitely don't want to have anything to do with you at all. I just think that's wrong. But yeah, so it is a prickly issue, and I think Alistair was wrong in how he handled it. But at the same time, I understand the nature of it.
Yeah, and it's the same thing with John Piper. John Piper wants to have a bridge between, like he's teamed up with men like Mark Driscoll and Rick Warren. He's preached at the Passion Conference and things like that. So I think he's trying to keep himself, he's been with Francis Chan. He wants to keep himself with these guys, whereas MacArthur would not. But it's that same kind of slippery slope. You're going to be associated with them, or what is your purpose for hanging out with them?
Yeah, I mean, and that is hard to defend especially with Piper. It's hard to defend. I mean, I think we've talked about it. I think he's been, locked arms with, or is at least to a certain level endorsed Francis Chan, and Francis is a guy that's definitely gone off the reservation.
Yeah.
In my opinion. And so, agree. Yeah. So that is problematic. But I again, it was a funeral, and
right.
and it was a family decision. So
the only way Grace Church would lose me if they chose John Piper to be the pastor. If they said, John Piper's our pastor for the next 2 years, I'd be like, okay, bye, Grace.
Yeah, that's a whole different conversation altogether as to who we think is going to move.
No, I don't.
I happen to think, that you didn't ask the question, but I happen to think that we don't even know who, we probably haven't even heard of the one who they're going to end up, or maybe we've heard of them, but would never dream of them being the pastor at Grace Community Church. So I don't think it's going to be among the people who have, are more well-known and being connected that way. I think the Lord is going to raise up somebody else, but I'm not a prophet. So that's just kind of on a side note. But.
Yeah. I've heard Phil Johnson say they may select someone from outside. It might not be inside. Which they have a lot of people who would be qualified. But so quickly as we go, just touch on the fact that what happened with Mark MacArthur when he got up. I heard that I didn't see the live stream live. I saw it Sunday. I didn't even know this had happened, but he was cut out. Or they stopped the podcast, or what happened?
Well, I think he was cut out. I mean, I think it was all filmed, but I think it was cut out before it was posted on Sunday. And so I mean, you watched on Sunday, yeah. So, you said you never saw Mark get up.
No.
But you look at the original film and the full version, and he actually did speak. He came up after Matt and before Jubilant Sykes sang.
Okay.
And on the service order, he wasn't on the service order. But we don't. I mean, it would be conjecture on our part to say why that happened. I mean, we could obviously, well, maybe not everybody, probably not everybody knows, but he was involved in a financial situation where some wrongdoing he was accused of some wrongdoing and was actually fined by the SEC, and that came out a couple of years ago, and so you could, if, by way of conjecture, you could say, well, they were ashamed of that and they didn't want to have him there because of that. It could have been relationship issues, but we don't know. I mean, we don't know, and I probably need to be careful even bringing those things up as possibilities, but ultimately we don't know what and why. We don't know why he wasn't, but we know that he did, and everything that he had to say, I thought was very good. Yeah. Like I really thought it was really solid, and I really appreciated the things that he said. So about his dad, and he said things that a son should say about his father, especially if his father was a godly man.
Yeah, I thought Matthew did a great job too.
Yeah,
both
for
his
sure.
sons did a good job.
For sure.
Okay. Well, that's all the time we have for this podcast. Any parting words?
Parting words, like parting your hair?
Do you still part your hair?
I do. I think I've had the same hairstyle since I was 18, but I don't think I've changed, which may not be a good thing. I don't know.
You never had long hair, did you?
No, I never was able to grow out my hair long. There was a time when I wanted to, but it just looked dumb. So I always got tired of it and had it cut. Now when I was young, I did have longer hair, like overall, like I had a fuller head of hair for sure. And I had really thick hair at the time, and I kept it longer. And so it kind of looked like a hair helmet for a while there. And it was definitely a good way to keep girls from wanting to to spend time with you.
You've been listening to Fresh Bread, a podcast ministry of Grace Bible Church Gainesville. For more information, go to gracegainesville.org. And thanks for listening.